Hey, welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntra's here. This is part 2 of my 2013 conversation with Anthony Tollin. Anthony, again, one of the guys part of DC production in the 70s and 80s. He and his wife, Adrienne Roy, were colorists and letterers. And Anthony also wrote incredible essays for things like Denny O'Neil and Mike Coluto's Shadowrun in the 70s. And also the 80s post-Howard Chaykin series, and also Andy Helfer and Kyle Baker and the like that made the post-Chaykin Shadowrun into the late 80s and into the early 90s. He also republished a lot of pulp novels for Dark Savage, The Shadow, a lot of the other pulp heroes as well. All discussed in this conversation. Old-time radio talk as well. Anthony is really a pop culture historian of the 20th century, and I'm glad he's with us, and I'm glad he's still a voice, and he's done extensive research, plus his own enjoyment of the product as well, and really brings a great insight to the building blocks of what became the superhero era, the things that came before it, like old-time radio, like pulp novels. And this is part 2 of our conversation. Part 1 is also posted, so if you're just listening to this one, you might want to go back an episode and catch the beginning of our conversation as well. But we continue our talk with Anthony Tollin today on Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners, my producers, if you will, because they give me the funds to keep Word Balloon going via Patreon at patreon.com. If you like the show and want to help out, it would be greatly appreciated. I'm not asking you to break the bank. Can you spare the price of a comic book a month? Even $1 a month would really help me out and keep things going. You know, I've expanded Word Balloon the last couple years to be an almost daily podcast and provide a really great look into pop culture. And that is because I get great help from the League of Word Balloon listeners. Again, if you could help out, it would be greatly appreciated. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you very much for your great support, the League of Word Balloon listeners. Now available to order at your local comic shop, it's Sal Abenanti's new graphic novel, The Hostage.
Hostage is set in the streets of Rio de Janeiro, based on the plight of the street children that live in the favelas. In the world of the graphic novel, being murdered daily, and the hostage is the evil spirit that is raised to avenge their death. Origins go all the way back to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon as the spirits that protect children, especially murdered children. The level of death that these kids have to endure every day. They have nowhere to sleep. They have no place to eat. They have to survive off of begging. There were nobody in capes that were coming to save these kids.
Pick up Sal Abenanti's latest graphic novel, The Hostage. Order now at your local comic shop through Diamond's Previews catalog. Code DEC221534. Okay, it's time to wrap things up. We're going to present part 2 of our conversation with Anthony Tollin. Anthony, as you learned last week, was a colorist for DC Comics during much of the Bronze Age, along with his wife, Adrienne Roy. And then, when work started to dry up for DC, he switched his energies to old-time radio. He was a big fan of old-time radio and worked for a couple companies providing essays for their cassette collections and CD collections, but then also really got involved with his other love, pulp heroes, and has been writing wonderful essays about the pulp era and the pulp heroes of the era. Now, with his Sanctum books, he has been representing the original pulps of The Shadow and Doc Savage. He is a former friend of Walter Gibson, the creator of The Shadow. He has a great extensive knowledge of the histories of The Shadow and Doc Savage, of Gibson and the Savage writer Lester Dent. And I'm telling you, I just thought this was a fantastic conversation, a lot of good, deep
Pulp Fiction history, which, as we know, is the bedrock from where comic book heroes came from. So a nice way to finish things off in our conversation with Anthony Tollin and our episode today on Word Balloon.
I came into old-time radio fandom at just the right time, and thanks to the generosity of Jay Hickerson at the Friends of Old Time Radio Convention, for years directed all, and then some, continued just doing some, but of the old-time radio show cast reunions. And
what were some of the shows that?
I directed The Shadow in my very first one. We were not able to get Bill Johnstone. We had Dwight Weeft, who was Weston on the show, filling in as The Shadow. But I had Ken Roberts announcing, and Margot Stevenson, who was Orson Welles' Margot Lane, as Margot, and Trudy Warner, the last Margot Lane, playing the judge's secretary, and I had Arnold Moss, who was a great radio actor and Shakespearean actor, also was Caridian in the Star Trek episode Conscience of the King.
Oh, yeah.
He played Batman in, like, the 1950s Batman radio audition pilot.
Unbelievable.
He also starred in Cabin B-13 on radio. And on shows like The Shadow, he was, what was the Burning Radioactive Man? The man who...
Oh, shame on me, man. And I love The Shadow. I'm a Brett Morrison guy myself. I love Bill Johnstone, don't get me wrong. But I'm a Brett
Frank Reddick is my favorite. And
that's cool.
He played The Shadow as narrator, and of course, all the Orson Welles shows open and close with Frank Reddick's openings. Orson was the only person to play The Shadow who never did the Who Knows What Evil Lurks in the Hearts of Men.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yes.
And Frank is just so sibilant and so venomous. Who knows what evil lurks? And, Brett was almost Shakespearean. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? By the way, I own Brett Morrison's cape from Mr. Wow. in The Shadow. I also own the original Shadow hat from the Pulp magazine cover. It's given to me by Jerome Rosen. So I say my house is where the Shadow hangs his hat, though actually it's in a hat box. But no, and then let's see, I had Arthur Anderson and Sidney Sloan, who started as an actor in The Shadow and ended up writing about 100 of the scripts. Carl Weber, who was Dr. Sixgun, but he appeared in The Shadow in supporting roles.
Cool, I'm a fan of Dr.
And the only actor in my cast who was not a member of the Shadow radio cast was Parley Bear as the villain, and Parley was Chester in Gunsmoke.
He had 1 million radio parts and 1 million television and film parts as well.
And then I also had Rosa Riel at the Hammond organ doing live music for it. And that was just, and later I did Aldrich Family and Great Gilder. I did Aldrich Family with Ezra Stone and Great Gildersleeve with Willard Waterman and Shirley Mitchell.
Fantastic.
I did Jack Benny radio show recreation with Eddie Carroll as Jack Benny and with Shirley Mitchell from the Jack Benny Show and a number of people from the Jack Benny Show. And my buddy Chuck McCann. And I also had Bill Dana. And
Bill Dana,
and Joe Franklin.
Wow, that's terrific.
There was a celebrity interviewer played in the Jack Benny Show I was recreating by Frank Nelson. And, I figured Joe Franklin knew how to play a radio celebrity interviewer. And Joe Franklin did an incredible Joe Franklin impression on the show. Joe is still at it. He's still doing his radio show every Saturday night.
That's amazing.
And he's been on for, 50, 60 years now?
Yeah.
And, had the first talk show, TV talk shows.
WOR, absolutely, man. I remember him. Unfortunately, I caught him in the 80s. That's the earliest I caught him in college, seeing him. But I know exactly what you're talking about. And
you know what the radio connection is between the Flash and radio?
Barry Allen, the Flash? Go on.
Barry Allen was named after, in the New York area, in broadcasting, the top radio talk show host and the top TV talk show host, Barry Gray and Steve Allen.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
And
I love Steve Allen. I'm a big fan.
And but yeah,
I didn't know Barry Gray.
Barry Allen was named after Barry Gray, who was, of course, at WR for many, many years.
Wow, man!
And Steve Allen. And
see, I grew up in Chicago, so most of I'm a huge old time radio fan, and just really Chuck Shaden's Chicago show that has now been passed to comic book writer Steve Darnall as well, continues the tradition, and it's a fantastic show.
And
so I'm, they're my teachers as far as old-time radio.
There was also a One Shadow series that came out of Chicago, the 1932 show for Perfecto Light. Only lasted 5 weeks.
Wow!
But it appears to have come out of Chicago. All the press releases are Dateline Chicago, and the producer of the show and the CBS broadcast program card files was out of the Ruth Roth and Ryan Chicago office.
Unbelievable!
So,
no, I didn't know that.
And of course, Brett Morrison grew up in Chicago.
Yes, the First Nighter show was a big show of his prior to.
And he went to the Nicholas Senn High School, as Sidney Sloan had, and also as Hugh Hipple, who became Hugh Marlowe and played Ellery Queen on radio, did.
Did Hugh Hefner go to Senn, or no? That may not be the right one. I was going to say Hugh Hefner, but I don't think he did go to Senn.
I don't know. I've been to the mansion a couple of times, and first time I went to the Playboy Mansion, all I saw was a Jimmy Cagney movie and a Daffy Duck cartoon. I had a great time. It was a very good Daffy Duck cartoon.
That's cool. I know he's a big comic book,
a big movie buff, and a big
nostalgia fan. Absolutely.
Oh yes, and a big fan of Pulp Fiction, and especially the Spider and the Spicy Pulps.
Oh, very cool. That makes sense.
And my friend Ed Holst, one of the longtime subscribers to his Blood and Thunder zine, is Hefner.
Oh, very cool.
And and it was actually a paid subscriber, and so as I said, I've been just incredibly lucky. I've got to work in, I have some friends who are rather bitter that their comic book careers, went away after 20 years. I was lucky to, go into something I enjoyed just as much, which was writing about old-time radio. And then, and now, reprinting. Walter Gibson was like my surrogate grandfather.
Yeah, I want to know about this relationship with Walter. I mean, it came through in the Shadow scrapbook, but tell us about the man who created the Shadow. I know his background in magic as well, but please, you're the expert.
Well, Walter was, of course, a Philadelphia newspaper writer, and was actually an incredibly successul writer. He came from money, which is very unusual at that time for pulp and comic book writers. I've run recently in some of my books some photos of the house Walter grew up in, the mansion he grew up in, which was a 3-story mansion with 3-story marble pillars in front in Germantown, Pennsylvania. And Walter's father had been the Secretary of Congress during the Lincoln assassination conspiracy trials.
Wow.
But Walter was someone who was making $10,000 a year in the 1920s, writing syndicated newspaper features for the Ledger Syndicate. I mean, he was doing the morning and evening crossword puzzles 7 days a week. He was doing after-dinner tricks. He was doing, series on ancient and occult mysteries and such, and was very successful. But with the shrinking of newspapers that came with the Great Depression, he was looking for some other, writing to do. And he'd sold a short story to Street and Smith and was looking to try and interest Detective Story magazine in some true crime writing, and just stopped in with no appointment one day, and stopped in at the right time when they were looking for a writer to who would work relatively cheaply initially to bring this radio character to life. And quite frankly, all the Shadow was at that time was a catchphrase, the Shadow knows, and a laugh, and a sinister voice. And they asked Walter if he had any ideas, and he'd actually been planning on trying a hardcover mystery novel, inspired in part by Robert Louis Stevenson's The Suicide Club, with people, instead of, arranging to murder each other, create each other's suicide, would instead take people on the brink of suicide and give them, a new career, a new mission in life. And Walter, explained the idea of the scene on the opening bridge, on the bridge, and they liked it. And Walter was given the assignment to write a shadow novel, and if they liked it, there would be 3 more after that for a quarterly magazine. And what Street and Smith wanted to do, they didn't expect the magazine to be a success. They wanted to make sure no one else would be able to copyright and trademark the name The Shadow. And at that time, you couldn't trademark a radio series, trademark things and on radio. Radio was still so new. I mean, this was the series started in July of 1930 with The Shadow narrating stories from Detective Story magazine. Mm-hmm. And so they came up with this idea of, calling this, narrator The Shadow. And Walter Gibson was given the job of trying to flesh out this character. And he already had this general mystery character in mind. And he'd wanted a character who had was a master of illusion and who possessed the ability to escape from restraints that Houdini did. And Walter had all of Houdini's private notebooks were turned over to Walter after Houdini's death.
Wow.
And, he had been done PR work for Dunninger and Thurston and Blackstone. And
Blackstone the magician, sure.
Oh, yeah. And
Dunninger and Thurston were also magicians as well, stage magicians?
And, anyway, there was to be 4 quarterly novels if they liked the first one. But and Street and Smith wasn't really expecting anything. In 1931, Walter, remember, there were only two pulp magazines launched that year that were successes, and those were The Shadow and Ballyhoo. And it was a terrible year for publishing. But magazines were closing down right and left. And over the next few years, Detective Story magazine went from quarterly to twice a month to monthly, while The Shadow went inside of the first year and a half from quarterly to monthly to twice monthly.
Wow.
And, and launched this whole new, genre, the hero pulp, which, 1933 saw, the Spider and Doc Savage and Nick Carter revival and Pete Rice and
you
the
mentioned
Phantom Detective in late 32.
Phantom.
Right.
Sure.
And
all these
and
great
of course,
characters.
And from the standpoint of popular culture, I mean, I mentioned the first Batman story was plagiarized. Well, I don't like using the term plagiarize. Was an unauthorized adaptation of a shadow novel. And but in general, I mean, the first generation of comic book creators, the Will Eisners and the Jack Kirbys and the Stan Lees and the Bill Fingers and Bob Kanes and Jerry Siegel and Joe Schusters, the superheroes of their childhood were pulp heroes.
Sure.
And, of course, Superman was inspired, Clark Savage, the Man of Bronze, with his Arctic Fortress of Solitude, inspired a lot of Clark Kent, the Man of Steel, with his Arctic Fortress of Solitude, as did Arn Monroe, a character by John W. Campbell, and John Carter of Mars. Siegel reversed it. Instead of an Earthman going to Mars and being able to jump huge distances on a planet with lesser gravity, you have the visitor from another planet with heavier gravity coming to Earth and being able to leap huge distances and such. But yeah, I mean, these were, Stan Lee has commented, on how Sergeant Fury and the Fantastic Four, a lot of them were influenced by Doc Savage. And
sure,
these were, when the early comic book creators, were looking for
inspiration
for these new superheroes, they looked on the superheroes of their childhood, which had been the pulp heroes.
Fair enough.
And also, of course, The Shadow was a relaunch of the first modern single-character magazine, which started, of course, it was a revival of the idea of the Nick Carter magazines of the dime novel era and Buffalo Bill Weekly and such. But
these were the teens, right? Or the
dime novels that started in the late 1800s, actually.
Shame on me.
Nick Carter predated Sherlock Holmes by 16 months.
Oh, I didn't realize
And
that. Wow, it goes that far back. Wow.
The first villains in popular fiction, the first recurring villains, people say Moriarty, and Moriarty actually appeared later, but also was not a recurring character in the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Right.
Doyle's. But
yeah.
Burton Quintard and Diva, the Archfiend, and Dr. Quartz and Nick Carter were reoccurring, master villains, which strongly inspired, the continuing recurring super foes of comics.
Sure. Fu Manchu was post Conan Doyle, right? But
right.
Early
Well,
in
and
that...
of course, Nayland Smith was, very much inspired. Was very much based
Certainly.
on Sherlock Holmes. I mean,
absolutely.
They the villain. By the way, Walter Gibson knew both Sax Rohmer and Conan Doyle.
Crazy.
Walter was introduced to Conan Doyle by their mutual friend Houdini. And,
wow. Very quickly, give the page rate back then, or I guess the word rate for pulp writers back then.
Walter and Lester Dent were not really, a lot of pulps. Actually, in the 1920s, a lot of pulps had paid, the better pulps like Argosy and Ulstery had paid a nickel a word. But generally in the 30s with the Depression, a penny or a cent and a half were generally the word rates. By the middle to late 30s, Walter Gibson and Lester Dent were, each getting like $650 or $700 per novel.
Okay.
Now that translated, since they'd started at like 65,000 words, but had gone down to about 40,000 words or so. That translated to about a cent and a half a word. But the interesting thing was that they had a novel rate. And the funny thing was, we've been doing, Will Murray and I, in the reprints, have done a lot of restorations. Will, I publish it, but Will has largely, ramrodded it.
Okay.
Restoring. There was an assistant editor at Street & Smith, one of John Nanovik's assistant editors, whose name was Morris Jones, I believe.
Okay.
And Morris Ogden Jones. And he loved to cut chapters and cut pieces out to fit an additional short story in the back of the book, which I really can't understand because, A, you would think the reader was buying the magazine for Doc Savage, not for the backup filler. And also the strange thing was, if you cut out, 5,000 or 7,000 words out of the back of the magazine, you would have to, buy at a cent a word, 5,000 or 7,000 words in a short story to fill it. And you wouldn't save any money because Lester Dent, was being paid the same flat rate. But, for example, Mystery Under the Sea, which we reprinted in Doc Savage number 22, re-restored 7,000 words that had never been published before.
Wow.
And there was just in Doc Savage 66, both novels were restored. And the first novel in that book, which was The Midas Man, had 5,000 words restored. And that's words, no one except the editor who cut it out has ever read before. And
how are you guys finding? How are you able to find these lost
Lester Dent's archives and his manuscripts are, exist in a university in Missouri.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
He tried, the same assistant editor tried it with Walter Gibson, and when he got to the end of the Shadow novel, found he had to restore everything he'd taken out. Because Walter's novels were so tightly plotted. Walter would write, as opposed to pulp writers like Norval Page, who,
the Spider.
Who would tend to just, write off the cuff. And Wilbury wrote a wonderful online article called Stop Me From Reading Another Spider, about how he's driven crazy because he'll get to the end of a Spider novel and turn out that the villain is someone who was never mentioned in the novel, or the mastermind turns out to be, or turns out to be someone who was mentioned in two sentences, the second of which was the one where he died. and Will, explained that he really thought that Norval Page didn't figure out who the mastermind was until he got to the last chapter and just took a name at random because he certainly wasn't planning clues. But Walter would write about a 20-page, typewritten outline working on all the details in the novel. And Walter said, he was writing 24 shadow novels a year.
I was going to say, he's a machine. I remember that ad you printed for Smith Corona typewriters, kind of celebrating his...
nearly 1.5 million words written in 10 months or something. But Walter said that each shadow novel generally took 10 days to write, 10 working days. And that would be 1 day to research, 3 days to write a very intense plot outline, very detailed plot outline, and then 60 hours, which could be 6 10-hour days or 4 15-hour days or 5 10-hour days, or 5 12-hour days or something, to flesh it out to the full novel, which was largely writing dialogue and mood and such to the outline. And Walter said he always felt the time was very well spent. And there are a number of Lester Dent novels, some of which are being expanded and finished by Will Murray. By the way, Will just came out through Altus Press, not through Sanctum Books. But he's been writing these new wild adventures of Doc Savage. Of course, he wrote 7 new Doc Savage novels for
Yes.
Sanctum, but he's written 5 new ones, and the latest one is the first Doc Savage crossover. And I have not read it yet. I've just got it, and I've heard great things about it. Some people are calling it the best Doc Savage novel ever written.
Wow.
But it's the first Doc Savage crossover novel, and it's teams Doc up with another character who debuted the month after Doc Savage magazine debuted. And the novel is titled Skull Island.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's Doc Savage as a young man with his father in 1920, right after World War I, on Skull Island encountering Kong.
Oh, wow. I was thinking Kit Walker, but even better that it's King Kong.
No,
fantastic.
not the Skull Cave, Skull Island.
Right, Skull Island. Shame on me, King Kong. Absolutely fantastic.
And
hilarious.
And, of course, they both have an Empire State Building connection, and they both debuted within a month of each other near the beginning of 1933.
That's crazy.
So,
fantastic.
But that's available from Altus Press, and you can find it online. And
I hope to talk to Will at some point. I've been enjoying his Writing in Bronze collection of essays.
Yeah, well, Will has had a real career. I mean, he wrote, I think, 41 or 42 or of the Destroyer novels, ghosted them.
Yes.
The Remo Williams, The Destroyer, and he wrote, he's now written about a dozen Doc Savage novels. As of this time, it is a dozen that have been published. And he's also wrote a Mars Attacks novel and a Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. novel.
Yes, I'm a fan of the Nick Fury novel, and yeah, his comic book work as well. Absolutely.
By the way, last night on TV there was a short promo for the new Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV series.
Yes, I'm. As we're recording, very, very much so, sir. I've been excited, and I've been talking to Jeff Loeb of Marvel Television as that progresses, and we're all pretty excited to see how that turns out come fall.
So, but anyway, as I said, it's Walter was the right man, and of course, what we think of the Shadow really, came out of who Walter was. Just, Lester Dent was an inventor, and developed a metal detector for his treasure hunting expeditions, and had his own electric garage door opener in the 30s, that he built and amazed his neighbors with. But Walter Gibson was from the world of magic and misdirection, and I mean, the key to his Shadow novels is it has a fairly grounded journalist sense of newspaperman's crime reporter sense of reality, but it also has a magician sense of misdirection, of showing you everything but making you look at the wrong thing. And his Shadow novels are really magic shows, and the only formula in them generally, and Walter believed that since the Shadow novels came out every other month, a formula would be deadly for it. He really avoided formula plots on them. But the one formula in the Shadow is generally that there is a twist behind the twist, which is something that is common in a magic trick. He tries to figure out what you're he thinks you may figure out the first twist, and he'll generally put another twist behind it somehow. There's one of his shadow novels, you reach the end, and it turns out the three principal characters are all impersonating each other.
Oh, wow.
And because nothing's ever what it... Well, I mean, and just the idea that the Shadow's true identity is Kent Allard, and that the Shadow only poses as Lamont Cranston, it's because he wanted to keep the Shadow mysterious. And, I mean, we come in this era today where, you expect every hero to have an origin. Walter felt if you knew he was really Lamont Cranston or Bruce Wayne or whoever, that, you'd killed a lot of the mystery of the character.
Sure.
And so he introduced the character of Lamont Cranston in the second Shadow novel, and then in the third novel introduced the real Lamont Cranston in a wonderfully titled chapter titled "Lamont Cranston Talks to Himself," and because that way kept the Shadow mysterious, that you would not know who he really was, and. Eventually, and it may have been a mistake, although I'm very fond of the novels with Kent Allard, but eventually he, revealed the Shadow was a former World War I aviator and spy named Kent Allard, which was based on the mystery of a couple of disappeared explorers, an aviator named Redford and an explorer named Fawcett. Colonel Fawcett, who had disappeared into the rainforest in Brazil and was never seen again. And there were all sorts of people, including Peter Fleming, the older, at that time, more famous brother of Ian Fleming, who went on an expedition searching for Fawcett.
Amelia Earhart, of course,
Right. But, I mean, Fawcett had disappeared in the same year that Allard disappeared. And Redfern had disappeared, and Allard was, of course, an aviator. And,
very cool.
And so, but this is the typical thing with Walter, that nothing is ever quite what it appears to be. And the Shadow's secret identity is just another mask. By the way, for your listeners who may not be aware, the Pulp character and the radio character are very different. Of course,
I wanted to talk about that. Go on.
And I thought one of the more intriguing parts, and one of the things I think they got right in the Shadow movie with Alec Baldwin, was in blending the two. I hated the new origin. I hated, some of the humor in it, like the atomic bombs, follow the bouncing atomic bomb being played for laughs rather than suspense. But I thought basically, they did something that was necessary in many ways, and that is the radio audience was so much larger than the pulp audience. The same thing in comic books and
movies,
and even animated TV shows. I mean,
sure.
X-Men for many years was the best-selling comic books, but the audience of an X-Men comic book is not anywhere near the audience of a Saturday morning cartoon.
Or the people that were complaining that Jon Stewart, who had been the Green Lantern of Justice League cartoons for many years, was nowhere to be found in the Green Lantern movie, and it really confused a lot of people. Right,
and but the movie with Alec Baldwin and everything really good in that movie came from the original first draft screenplay by David Koepp, and everything silly and ridiculous in the movie was edited in like 5 generations of rewrites by various producers and rewriters.
Yeah, I'm hoping we get because I agree with you. I think there's like a good 2/3 of a good Shadow movie in that Alec Baldwin movie, and yeah, that third act really kind of clunked things up.
Well, and also, while I hated the new origin, if it had started with the scene on the bridge and the Shadow in costume, and if the origin had been revealed through Margot's nightmares, through Cranston's nightmares, and Margot's telepathy or whatever, to let the audience learn it as Margot learns it. One of the things that I think really, sunk the Green Lantern movie is there was about 10 minutes of exposition at the beginning, which Hal Jordan has to learn once he becomes Green Lantern anyway. And Harlan Ellison used to say you should start the story as near to the action as possible. There was a horrible Lone Ranger movie. In about 1980. Legend of the Lone Ranger, and apparently because they were so wowed by Christopher Reeve as Superman, they decided to spend an hour of the movie with the Lone Ranger before he becomes a Lone Ranger unmasked.
That's John Reed. Yeah,
right.
That's John Reed.
And actually, that was a mistake, too, because that was picked up from a trivia book that was an error. Fran Stryker had never given, either on radio or TV or newspaper strips or whatever, had ever given the Lone Ranger a first name.
Wow, I didn't know. That's very interesting. Very good.
I've always suspected that he may have intended, the Lone Ranger's first name to be Britt, because, why would Ben Reed Jr. name his son Britt instead of naming it after his father, unless he perhaps named it after the uncle who raised him?
That's a shame. It should have been Britt Reed. You're right. That's too cool.
And maybe that was the reason it wasn't given. But, of course, the Britt Reed had the name Reed first. It was an afterthought to give it to the Lone Ranger, and I think, the ambush storyline didn't even come in until the Legion of the Black Arrow, storyline in.
Oh wow! I didn't know that.
In 41, and I think the Reed name may have been first introduced in 43. But anyway,
wow.
I mean, they spent an hour before he became the Lone Ranger, and if you ever saw the 1950s, the second Lone Ranger movie of the 50s, The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold, they tell the origin over the opening credits in a song.
Yes.
Expect the strangers, hi-oh, rode in the sun. And
I saw that at about a 5 or 6 year old birthday party when I was a little kid. I know exactly what you're talking about.
I saw it at a birthday party at about the same age, age too. But it was at a movie theater.
Understood. Yeah,
Saturday
me too.
Matinee. But anyway, and by the way, I talked to Armie Hammer, who lives in San Antonio.
Okay.
Playing the Lone Ranger in the new movie with Johnny Depp.
What's the word?
And I asked, well, he seems to be someone who respects the character. There's more of a supernatural element, and I'm not opposed to that.
Okay.
Where, of Indian, Native American mysticism and such. But it seems to be a serious action film, unlike the Green Hornet travesty of last year.
Thank God.
Ago. And Armie Hammer seems to like the character. He looks like a hero. And I asked him how long into the film does he become the Lone Ranger, and he said about 5 minutes.
Fantastic.
So, I think, that certainly bodes well. And if you remember the TV show, and I met Clayton Moore a few times, but John Hart was a very good friend of mine.
Cool. The second Lone Ranger, absolutely, yes.
On the TV show, for your listeners who may not know, John Hart played the Lone Ranger in 52 of the TV shows with Jay Silverheels as Tonto. And Clayton Moore did the first season, and then John Hart came in the second season, and then Moore came back third and fourth. By the way, at the time he was playing the Lone Ranger, he was romantically involved with Phyllis Coates, who was
John Hart or
John Hart.
John Hart.
John Hart.
Wow.
So and she was doing Superman, the first season of Superman, when he was playing the Lone Ranger, and so.
So the Lone Ranger was making time with Lois Lane.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
But anyway, in the Clayton Moore origin episodes, you never see his face. It's always in shadow or from the back. And I like that. I wish that it was being done in the new film, which it's not. But, they had this thing where, and I think that's another of the reasons why Fran Stryker never gave him a first name, to keep the character mysterious, and that whole idea that whoever he was before he became the Lone Ranger really doesn't matter. But anyway, I thought the one thing I really thought the movie, as I said, the Shadow movie got right. They found a way to combine the pulp hero with the black slouch hat and the cloak with the invisibility of the radio show. And there were some very good visuals in that film. Now, I'm kind of prejudiced because I had done some publicity work for Universal on that film. Okay. And was invited to the world premiere. And Universal Pictures was generous enough to let me bring along a couple of my friends. And I brought along Margot Stevenson, who was Margot Lane opposite Orson Welles, and Ed Cartier, who had been the interior artist on the Shadow novels in the late 30s.
Wow.
And
cool.
Ed was just thrilled to see scenes that he had drawn, because he had illustrated the Shi Wan Khan novels.
Oh, cool.
And Ed was just thrilled to see scenes he'd drawn brought to the screen. He was also a huge Orson Welles fan, and he was just thrilled to be sitting next to an actress who had played Margot Lane opposite Orson Welles.
That's excellent, man.
By the way, Margot Stevenson died just 2 years ago. and she was died a month before her 99th birthday. And her father was 60 years old when she was born.
Oh, my God.
And her father was I'd known her father was a stage actor, but until the memorial service, I hadn't known that her father, Charles Alexander Stevenson, had co-founded Actors Equity in 1913.
Wow.
And as a leading man, had performed on stage with Edwin Booth.
Incredible, man. Of course, John Wilkes Booth's a much more talented brother.
Right. And who, by the way, everyone remembers the John Wilkes Booth Lincoln connection. They generally aren't aware of the Edwin Booth Lincoln connection because about 3.5 months before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by his younger brother, Edwin Booth was riding a train with a contingent of Union soldiers. And a Union soldier fell between the cars and was about to go under the wheels and was hanging on for dear life. And Booth reached down and pulled him to safety and received a letter of commendation, which still exists at the Players Club in New York, from the young soldier's colonel, thanking him for saving the life of Robert Lincoln.
Wow.
Abraham Lincoln's son. Now, you'd never believe that in a novel or a movie, but 3.5 months before his brother assassinated Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Booth saved the life of Lincoln's son.
Incredible.
And,
wow.
And that was one of the few things that allowed him to get through. I know about other things other than just comics and radio. One of the things that allowed Edwin Booth to get through, the disgrace of the assassination and such, is he knew that, what it would have been like for Lincoln to have lost his last surviving child. And that he had saved the life of Lincoln's son. And amazing small world situation. But I guess this is kind of, in terms of your interview, kind of like, George Allen asking Gracie Allen to tell him about her brother. And she goes on for the next 15 minutes. But
No, it's all good, Anthony. I promise you. And I am pleased to say that you join the ranks of people like Marty Pasco, who can show your breadth of knowledge of the comics and pulp world. And no, honestly, this is the kind of stuff that my listeners absolutely love.
Well, Marty,
the tangents are welcome.
Marty is, was one of us, and Carrie Bates and Elliot Magan, Jack Harris and Bob Rozakis and Paul Levitz. As I said, it was a very interesting time because, 20 years had gone, without anyone really new in the business, or with very few new. And suddenly we were all there. We tended to party together. There was a studio that was made, shared by Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta and Jeff Jones and Barry Smith. And, or Neil Adams Continuity Associates. And
okay. Friar Tuck's? Was Friar Tuck's a big hangout, or was that for the old guys?
Yeah, that was more for the older guys.
Okay, because I know about that place, certainly in New York. That's a bar that I think the old-timers would frequent. Go on.
And there was also a bar called Costello's on around 42nd or 43rd, where the National Cartoonist Society met, and the wall was decorated in the back room with, had a mural drawn by all these famous cartoonists. But yeah, it was a very special time, and I count myself very lucky, because I got to be friends with so many, not just of the comic book people and the pulp people, and the old-time radio people. I got to know not only Walter Gibson, but, John Nanovic, the editor of the Shadow magazines.
Wow.
One of the things, in my Shadow and Doc Savage reprints, I read a lot of other pulp reprints from other publishers, and I'm disappointed that they don't have this historical material that comes with ours. Because we always have, articles by Will Murray and myself and by others at times.
Harlan Ellison, absolutely. I'm a big fan of all those articles.
I've had forwards by Harlan Ellison and Dick Ayers talking about how the Shadow inspired Ghost Rider and Jerry Robinson and Harlan Ellison and Mark Wilson, the magician, and Everett Raymond Kinsler. By the way, talking
wonderful
about
fabulous
memories, Walter Gibson had a fabulous and amazing, almost photographic memory. And when he was 87, a year before he died, he did a magic presentation, of his magic act at the Players Club in New York, the Private Actors Club. Mm-hmm. That's housed in Edwin Booth's old mansion. And after the show, after the show, Everett Raymond Kinsler, who, of course, Ray Kinsler jokes that he's the only high school dropout with a life membership in the Yale Club. He dropped out of school at age 15 to become a comic book inker and is the only man to have painted 6 United States presidents from life, including the official White House portraits of Ford and Reagan.
The Ford painting in the Shadow scrapbook, in fact.
Right. But anyway, Everett Raymond Kinsler, after the show, walks up to Walter Gibson and said, "Mr. Gibson, I'm very pleased to meet you. My name is Everett Raymond Kinsler, and when I was 19 years old, I illustrated one of your Shadow novels." And Walter replied, "Yes, you did. The White Skulls, November 1945. Ray was impressed. And I've also had forwards by Denny O'Neil. I had an unpublished forward by Walter Gibson and Doc Savage. I've had forwards by Lester Den on how Doc Savage came into being. I had a forward by Jerry Conway, who at the time was one of the writers of Law and Order CI, and of course has been a major comic book writer. Jerry is a huge Doc Savage fan and collects the Doc Savage pulps.
I've seen him at the pulp shows. Go on, sir.
And again, Wilson did the first forward back in Shadow number 4, the first celebrity forward we did, as someone who had grown up with the pulps. But yeah, Harlan Ellison did a wonderful forward, not just on the Shadow, but also on his friend Alfred Bester, who wrote about 40 of the Shadow radio shows.
Absolutely, and was a big Green Lantern contributor as well back in the 40s.
Right, and of course was the person who came up with the Green Lantern Oath in Brightest Day and actually when Bester wrote it, it was in Brightest Day and Darkest Night, no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evil's might beware my power, Green Lantern's light. And when Henry Kuttner took over in, I think, 45, Kuttner changed it to, or Julie Schwartz, one or the other, changed it to in Brightest Day and Blackest Night instead of in Brightest Day and Darkest Night. Then that
understood
continued to the present day. But as I said, I just count myself extremely fortunate. I got to work on many of the top comic books at DC. I originally wanted to be a penciler or an editor, but then I found I could make better money generally. Not better money than the George Perez's and such, but, my wife and I, for about 15 years or so, generally colored about 85% of the top comics at DC, and generally colored at least 100 pages, a week, and probably, 4 or 5 covers a week.
Wow.
And, we were coloring Superman and all the Batman books and Green Lantern and Mike Grell's Warlord and Teen Titans. She colored 202 issues of Detective Comics and 193 issues of Batman, plus Brave and Bold and Batman on the Outsiders and Shadow of the Bat and Gotham Knights and Robin and whatever else, Batman.
Sure.
So I count myself, as I said, extremely lucky. And then, to be able to work with so many of these great old-time radio actors. I got to co-produce a show directed, a recreation of The Plot to Overthrow Christmas that Norman Corwin directed. And I put together a reunion of his old actors, including, Ken Roberts and Lon Clark and Dwight Weist. And
I was going to say Ken Roberts and Lon Clark. Those are great names. Lon Clark, for people who don't know, Nick Carter, Master Detective,
through the entire
run on radio.
Through the entire 12-year run of the radio show.
Crazy. And, absolutely.
And Lon was a wonderful man, and later for years did the Actors Equity charity funds, and also was the administrator of the Episcopal Actors Guild charity. So for down and out actors, and there was an endowment among other things. Someone had left, I think, the Actors Fund money, so that any actor pounding the pavement looking for work could get a free pair of shoes.
Huh.
But
every bit helps. Absolutely, man. That's cool.
But Lon Clark was fascinating. He had started in Minneapolis radio and then Chicago and Cincinnati radio. And he had been one of Red Skelton's comedic stooges on radio.
Oh, wow.
And it was actually Lon who created and first played the character Clem Cadiddlehopper.
Wow.
When Lon moved to New York, Red continued and played himself after that time.
Huh.
But, of course, Lon was also the comic weekly man enacting the Sunday comics on WOR. team features Puck the Comic Weekly.
Wow.
Sunday.
So we're talking like Flash Gordon?
Flash Gordon and Prince Valiant and, probably the Phantom. And Lon Leader played Mandrake the Magician in a record album, The Official Adventures of the Phantom and Mandrake. Brett Morrison was heard as the Phantom on that album.
Crazy.
And
was that in the 60s?
That was in I think 1972 maybe.
Okay.
But they came out. They had The Official Adventures of Flash Gordon, which Buster Crabbe played Flash Gordon on, and they had The Official Adventures of the Shadow and Prince Valiant, and they did a Green Lantern, Flash, and Aquaman record album.
Was this Power Records, or was this something different?
This was Leo the Lion Records. These were produced by Herb Galowitz, who also did a lot of classic newspaper strip collections. By the way, to mention some of the things upcoming from Sanctum Books.
Please.
I will be, in addition to the regular Shadow reprints, I'm doing a new edition of Return of the Shadow, which was the 1964 paperback original, which Mike Kaluta will be illustrating.
Is that Dennis Lin's? Was he the...
No, Walter Gibson wrote the first one, and then Dennis Lin.
Oh, that's right.
And then I'm doing the new issue of the Shadow scrapbook, and I'll also be doing a collection of the Shadow newspaper strips. The year run of the Shadow newspaper strip by Walter Gibson and Vern Green. And the last 3 adventures have never been reprinted.
Because you did print some of it in the scrapbook, correct?
The first storyline was reprinted in the scrapbook.
Okay.
And Vern Green, who drew the Shadow newspaper strip and the early Shadow comic book stories, had previously assisted Chick Young and Blondie.
Oh,
and
wow.
he later took over bringing up Father from the creator George McManus when McManus died.
Crazy. All right.
But
interesting.
the very good illustrator, in fact, in the issue of The Whisperer at the printer right now, volume 6 of The Whisperer, in addition to 2 Whisperer novels, I reprint the first Norgel the Magician comic book story by Gibson and Vernon Green.
Very cool.
And it's one of the things I've been doing in some of my recent volumes. I did a reprint of the first 2 Phantom Detective novels, and I also included the first Phantom Detective comic book story, which was by E.E. Hibbard, who drew a lot of the Golden Age Flash and Justice Society adventures.
Oh, wow.
I did I'm publishing the Spider now in double novel reprints as well. In the Avenger...
is that coming up?
There's another Avenger out, about to come out.
Good.
The Nick Carter, I've been reprinting some Nick Carter comic book stories, and in the second volume of Nick Carter, I will be doing thanks to the generosity of Dynamite Comics, who owns the Shadow reprint rights, but they okayed my reprinting this. There was an 8-page Golden Age comic book story with the Shadow teamed up with Nick Carter, and it's fighting a villain named Vox, who had previously appeared in Walter Gibson. The first season of the Nick Carter radio shows were scripted by Walter Gibson with Ed Ruskin, and the second script featured this villain Vox. And there's a sequel in the comic book where the Shadow teams up with Nick Carter to battle Vox.
That's fantastic. Both printed by Street and Smith back in the day, obviously. Right?
And
yeah.
So I've been running some Golden Age comic book reprints where it doesn't conflict with other licenses. And as I said, we have this Norgel the Magician story. That one of the interesting things that I mentioned, about how the hero pulps inspired the early comic book superheroes, and even Silver Age characters like the Fantastic Four and Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. But the pulps also, the comic books very much contributed to the downfall of the pulp magazines. And it was with wartime paper rationing, suddenly you had Shadow Comics by 1941 were selling 425,000 copies per issue, which was much more than the pulps, and you want to use the paper to print one 128-page pulp magazine or two 64-page comic books. And especially with World War II, when so much of the audience of the pulps went overseas to fight the war, and most of the comic book audience were still underage.
Mm-hmm.
So
you had to cater to the audience that was there, obviously, in the bigger audience.
Mm-hmm.
I understand.
And
I wanted to go on. Go on.
And then go ahead yourself.
Well, I was wondering, and this is a slight detour, but it's tied to this. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the 2-page text stories from Golden Age comic books, the reason for their existence, and any little historic factoids you might be able to add to talking about.
Well, of course, they were mandated for second-class postage rates by the U.S. Post Office. If you wanted to be able to mail them to subscribers through the mail, they had to have at least those 2 pages of editorial text. Now, later in comic books, those were replaced by letter columns, but you had to have some text material in it. And of course, one of the interesting things is that's where Stan Lee's byline first appeared. He was hired as a office gopher by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, where they were encouraged to hire him as their gopher. Joe Simon was the editor at Timely, the first comics editor at Timely, and Stan Lee's cousin was Martin Goodman's wife, who was he was a cousin of the boss's wife, the owner's wife at Timely, and he was allowed to write some of the Captain America text adventures in the early Simon and Kirby Captain America comics, and then after Simon and Kirby moved to DC, he was made the interim editor, of which he stayed for a long, long time. Stan, I think, was only like 19 at the time, and his real aspirations was at that time was to be a playwright or something. And of course, frustrated actor, he later got to narrate a lot of the Marvel cartoon series and such, and of course makes his cameos in the films. Comic books have been very, very good to Stan Lee, as opposed to a lot of comic book professionals.
Understood. What about, as far as those 2-page text stories and stuff, mostly these were in anthology. I mean, most comic books back then were anthology titles. So even though Superman was on the cover of Action, a text story wasn't necessarily, like in the case of Stan Lee's Captain America stories, they weren't necessarily the lead hero, and a lot of times they really were other genres.
And I think often in Shadow Comics there'd be a Nick Carter or Chick Carter text story. But yeah, these were really mandated in order to qualify for mailing. And, getting back to comics, and this is totally off the beam of what I've been talking about, but one of the things I really love about Silver Age comic books, and this idea is not new with me. Mike Tiefenbacher wrote a wonderful article called I Was 12 in 1964, where he pointed a lot of these things out. But most comic books at that time had 3 stories. Some had 4, some had only 2. But generally 3 stories. And each of those stories probably had more plot than a current comic book does. And, when comic books were 12 cents each, any kid, with a decent, as Mike Tiefenbacher mentions, with a decent newspaper delivery or lawn mowing business could afford everything Marvel and DC published. But the thing I really like most is each company. Right now it's very hard, outside of the characters, to tell a Marvel comic from a DC comic. And at that time, not only did each company have its own styles, but each editor. There was no mistaking a Murray Boltinoff comic book from a Julie Schwartz comic book or a Mort Weisinger comic book or a Jack Schiff comic book at DC. And there was this wonderfully bizarre little company called ACG, American Comics Group, which published Herbie and Adventures Into the Unknown and John Force Magic Agent, edited by a man named Richard Hughes, which was just really bizarre. But, I mean, each company, you had power with the Thunder Agents and Undersea Agents. You had Charlton, which was this very strange little Connecticut company that was really a printing company that, and there was a wonderful story about the two owners meeting each other in prison. One was an embezzler and one was a music bootlegger, and deciding to, start publishing comic books. And, brought in their relatives from Sicily and to work as printers and such. And, but it was, but each company had it, and each editor had their own style. And, one would think they were a DC Comics fan, and you would eventually outgrow the, Jack Schiff Batman titles and move on to the Mort Weisinger Superman books, and then to the Julie Schwartz, Flash and Green Lantern and Adam Strange books, or maybe the Kanigher War books. And you wouldn't know that everything you were reading was by the same editor. But it's just, if you liked one Julie Schwartz book, you probably liked them all, and if you liked one Mort Weisinger edited title, you probably liked them all.
Okay.
So, everything is much more homogenized right now. Each editor at DC at that time had his own stable of artists who generally didn't work for the other editors. That changed with when Carmen Infantino became publisher and then president. But
have you read? Because honestly, I appreciate what you're saying. Honestly, and I would say though, certainly right now with DC's New 52 and what Marvel is doing with what they're calling Marvel Now, I do think the companies have kind of gotten more distinct in terms of the way that they're, maybe not within the specific editorial regimes of each company, but I do think a Marvel book is very different from a DC book today.
Well, I will take your word for it, and quite frankly, I work about 75 hours a week now.
Wow. Yeah, I understand that.
Editing and packaging. I do virtually all the graphic production on my books too. So I will take your word for it, and quite frankly, every generation have their comics. And Stan Lee used to say to his editors, never forget that every comic book you edit is going to be some kid's first comic book.
Absolutely.
Experience. And so, the comic books being published now aren't really being published for my generation anymore. And I'm very happy reading the archives editions of the Marvel Masterworks and the DCs, and reading the Golden Age stuff, and reading the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. And, one of the things I've become aware of in recent, I came into the business at a low period in the Bronze Age. And because I came in at a time when maybe quality hadn't sold that well and DC wasn't really pushing, we'd had period of a couple years with Green Lantern, right before I came in, with, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and Dead Man, and Batlash, and such.
Sure.
It was a new golden period, and I came in at a period which was maybe, with the exception of Swamp Thing and Hubert Tarzan, may have been a brief, lull. But then came the things that we were so involved with, like the Wolfman Perez Teen Titans, and the periods when, Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and Doug Mensch were writing Batman, and Don Newton and Gene Tollin and Jim Aparo were drawing it.
Yep.
Which were, wonderful periods, and I'm really pleased to have been a part of that.
That was that 80s direct market kind of period. And as you mentioned, the Baxter paper stuff, the Legion and Titans coming out on Baxter paper and being separate from the newsstand. And then
I was also for about 100 issues cover colorist on Legion. And
fantastic.
But it was, and Jerry Jones was writing Green Lantern some of that time, and Steve Englehart.
Yep.
The second Justice League I colored back in 1977 was the origin of the Justice League -1, which
was that Englehart story?
Right,
that,
illustrated by Dick Dillon.
Yes.
And it was set, I think, in 1959 or something. It was a little bit of takeoff of the Orson Welles War of the Worlds idea of a Martian panic because of the Martian Manhunter, and the Justice League assembling to, supposedly, combat this Martian. But it was actually not the Justice League. It was the various superheroes, including, Flash and Superman and Aquaman and the Challengers of the Unknown and the Blackhawks and
Yep.
maybe the Sea Devils, and I know Rex the Wonder Dog and Congarilla were there.
Yep. Wasn't Darwin Cook kind of took the seeds of that and came up with New Frontier, correct?
And the interesting thing is, since it was involved with NASA, they had Hal Jordan involved before he became Green Lantern.
Yeah, Hal Jordan instead,
he was there at the very, first Justice League adventure before he was a superhero. But yeah, that was a wonderful, that was my second issue of Justice League I colored, and that was when they were the, double length of 34-page.
Yeah, I bought it off the stand, sir. I remember it well.
And,
one of my favorite Justice League stories. I've told Englehart that myself. Absolutely.
And Dick Dillon was a very, underappreciated artist. And when you realize he did I think he missed one issue of Justice League out of a run that ran like 120 issues or something.
Yeah,
And he missed one issue at a time when it was, a double-sized book. And then, of course, for decades before, he'd been the main artist on Blackhawks.
Yep.
And, there's a very special thing. You talk to the people, and, of course, regrettably, they're no longer around to be talked to. But, Jerry Robinson's memories of the early years of comics. And, whatever you're doing in broadcasting, whatever field, it's the period when you're in your 20s and just, learning something new every day and excited because you're in your dream job and you're working with people you've always wanted to work with. And you're creating your own world, your own professional world, and that you're, as I mentioned, you're one of the people who wasn't satisfied to stay in your hometown.
Sure.
Whether you went to New York to pursue, a career on Broadway as an actor or dancer or, in broadcasting but you put yourself there working with the best, in the field.
Mm-hmm.
And you're young. And as I said, at my time, I got to work with the people who've been there since the beginning of the comics business. One of the things I mentioned earlier about my books, and I'm publishing The Spider now, and we're doing, in double novel volumes, and we're doing historical articles, like we do in the Shadow and Doc Savage books.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't do them to the extent because, and I keep wishing other pulp reprint publishers would do more of this kind of thing, but quite frankly, with the exception of the Shadow and Doc Savage, there's just not the paper trail. John Natovic, who was editor of the Shadow and Doc Savage, lived until 2001 and attended a lot of pulp conventions and, wrote a lot of correspondence and was interviewed a lot of times. Walter Gibson lived to December of 1985 until he was 88 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Lester Dent saved all of his correspondence, all of his manuscripts. So Will Murray can put together, historical articles, and, and Walter Gibson, as I said, was interviewed a lot. So, with almost most Shadow novels, we have material of Walter Gibson describing how that novel came into being.
Cool.
That doesn't exist with the Spider novels. That doesn't exist with
The Whisperer?
The Operator 5. Well, the Whisperer, John Natovic, at least lived in the Avengers.
Oh, okay.
And, some of these people were interviewed, but Norval Page, who wrote The Spiders, there are like 2 photos of him.
Wow.
That the family has. And, one is like a driver's license photo or something,
Oh, my God. Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit of correspondence by him on the Spider. There's a little bit from some of the Spider editors, but there's just not the paper trail and the historical material that there is on the Shadow and Doc Savage. And, of course, on the Shadow, there's also all these radio people I spoke to or who were interviewed by other people.
Sure.
Brett Morrison, I spoke to when I was working on the Shadow scrapbook. I interviewed Bill Johnston over the phone a few times. Cool. John Archer was a very good friend of mine, and I was a house guest. In fact, the 500th Batman story in Detective Comics, which was in Detective Comics number 526, was colored on John Archer's kitchen table.
Wow.
The table of the man. And it's kind of fun because that issue teamed Batman with Sherlock Holmes and Slam Bradley and the Elongated Man as other detectives. But
yes, the Alan Davis, Mike Barr and Alan Davis story, absolutely.
Right. But it was actually colored by Adrian and me on the Shadow's kitchen table. So I had just directed John Archer in a Shadow recreation at the Spurdback Convention.
Fantastic.
Well, wonderful. It was wonderful. Listen to this cast. John Archer as the Shadow. Leslie Wood as Margot Lane.
An original Margot Lane.
Dwight Weeft as Commissioner Weston, who, of course, played Commissioner Weston opposite Orson Welles and Bill Johnstone.
Wow.
Andre Baruch announcing.
Awesome.
Villains were Les Tremayne and Alice Frost.
Excellent.
Both everyone in the cast had been on the Shadow. And
Les Tremayne also, by the way, mentor on the Shazam television series, among other things, but go on.
Right, and was also, of course, the Thin Man and Mr. Abbott and Abbott Mysteries, and was also the Falcon.
Oh, man.
And
I met him 30 years ago, which was just a thrill. And he was so nice.
Right,
Les Tremayne.
and then I also had as the victims Bill Zuckert and Amzie Strickland. And Amzie filled in as Margot Lane in 2 episodes of The Shadow.
Wow.
So, I had eight cast members from the Shadow radio show.
And real old-time radio veterans, absolutely.
Yeah. And also I'd actually pre-recorded the music for that one at Rosa Rios' house on her Hammond organ. And by the way, now, Rosa was an amazing case. Rosa Rio, who was a silent film organist and then, had been the organist on the Goodrich Shadow shows.
Okay.
Orson Welles. And fill-in organist when Elsie Thompson was on vacation in later seasons. Rosa was also the first organist on As the World Turns on TV.
Oh, crazy.
And, of course, did Between the Bookends with Ted Malone and did a lot of the radio soap operas and such.
Very cool.
But Rosa was still performing concerts in the early years of the 21st century, up until 2007. And a couple years before that, 2 years before that, for many years, I figured, I knew Rosa, I felt, had to be pushing 90, but looked much younger. And Rosa was still doing concerts and getting applause and doing the banter with the audience. And for many years, whenever Rosa was asked about her age, she would say that age was only a number and her number was unlisted. And she was performing a concert one year, I think around 2005, and she announced to the audience that it was her birthday, and the audience just would not give up and kept insisting on knowing which one. And finally she admitted that it was her 105th birthday.
Wow!
And she was still performing concerts at 107 when she broke her hip, and an infection set in, and she died 3 weeks before her 108th birthday.
Oh.
But she was still doing what she loved doing. She started performing professionally at age 8 as a piano, virtual organ, prodigy.
Wow.
And remembered playing for the jazz singer.
Oh, Al Jolson?
And crying through her as she played.
Because
she recognized that even though it was only a partial talkie, that this was spelled the end of her career. And of course,
wow.
in 1927 or whatever, she didn't see network radio on the horizon.
Sure. Unbelievable. Wow. Well, there you go, man.
So I've gotten to know and work with people like that. And of course, I got to color, the last story, recolor the series, and then color the last story that ended Jack Kirby's original New God series.
Oh, wow. The Hunger Dogs?
No, that was a graphic novel afterwards.
Oh, I see.
This
okay.
was the one that finished up the original continuity before.
Yeah, the original run. Okay.
I think Tom Zuko colored the Hunger Dogs, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I got to color Joe Simon's last Superman piece for DC Comics. I got to color Will Eisner. Adrian and I colored a PS magazine for Murphy Anderson, which was founded by Eisner for the Army.
Yes.
I did the National Lampoon's Sunday newspaper parody comic section.
Very cool.
And but worked with all these, these great people. And if I could, you asked me about current comic books, and quite frankly, I would have loved it if my comic book career continued, though I've been very, very happy, and probably, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing now, and I've been happy doing everything, I mean, anyone who complains when they're, getting paid to do what they love doing, there's no reason to complain.
Hear, hear.
But, I got to work in the business when I got to work with my idols, and my own generation, and I belong to, that generation of comics people. I got to work on Infinity Inc. with Jerry Ordway and Roy Thomas, and which was the Sons and Daughters of the Justice Society of America.
Absolutely, certainly, and I'm assuming a young Todd McFarlane back in the day.
We colored Todd McFarlane's much of his earliest work. Yes.
Very cool.
Back, $90 million or so ago for him. But yes, and I mean, he's one of the people. I mean, Jim Steranko, who of course did Nick Fury for Marvel, and who painted the Shadow paperback covers for Pyramid of Jove.
Those are the ones that I saw. Absolutely.
Was someone who realized that, I think early on, that the most talented, brilliant creator in the history of comic books, Jack Kirby. And I mean, a friend of mine and I used to challenge each other to, one of us to name major comic book heroes created by Jack Kirby, and the other to name major comic book characters created by anyone else. And to see who ran out of characters first. And it was always pretty even. And you do the same thing with major villains, too. And Jack Kirby was never more than maybe, at the most, somewhat comfortable upper middle class. I mean...
Yeah.
And yet his movies, Robert Downey Jr. was reportedly, with his 5% to 7% profit participation from the first dollar, supposedly took in $50 million for
Avengers. Yep.
That didn't go to the people who created these characters.
Yeah.
And
something wrong with that.
And although DC, to its credit, gave a very nice pension to Siegel and Schuster.
True.
For many, many years. And to a number of other people. Jerry Robinson ended up getting one. DC's also been very good, especially under Paul Levitz, in making sure really nice big bonuses went to Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil for revamping Batman in the 60s. And
yeah, and contributions that were reflected in the Nolan movies.
Right.
I know that from a lot of
for co-creating the Joker.
Absolutely.
And such. So DC's been very good about taking care of older people, people in the business.
Sure. Sure.
And settlements were also reached with Martin O'Dell on Green Lantern and such. And so, it's not all that black and white. But, there are lots of people who, have been treated well. Shelley Mayer, who had a job for life at DC, and pretty much Bob Gallagher. But
they're the exceptions, though, unfortunately.
right, and unfortunately, you look at Jack Kirby and Captain America and Mighty Thor and the Avengers and the X-Men and the Hulk.
Len Wein, Wolverine,
Right.
Marv Wolfman, Blade.
Right. And I'll tell you a wonderful, nice thing about Condé Nast, who licenses the Shadow and Doc Savage novels. And when I was starting out these reprints, Condé Nast's attorney called me and asked me if I had contact information for Walter Gibson's widow or his son. And I said, well, his widow died 8 years before or something, but yeah, I had his contact information for his son, and I said, why does Condé Nast need it right now? And he said, well, Condé Nast is aware that it had an oral agreement with Walter Gibson to split the royalties during his lifetime and paperback reprints with him 50-50. And Walter was also agenting the books at those times and, finding the publishers and getting them published. But he said, and there appears to be nothing in that agreement that pertained to after Gibson's death, but Condé Nast decided it wants to continue honoring it.
Wow.
So half the royalty checks I send to Condé Nast for my reprints go to Walter Gibson's son.
Wow, that's fantastic. Man, that's great to hear.
And, that is not normal, for someone who, wrote books in the 30s.
And no contractual obligation, and Condé Nast has gone through various corporate, buyouts and iterations since its original Street and Smith days.
Well, no, it was originally Street and Smith, which was purchased by Condé Nast, which was then published by Newhouse Advanced Magazines. Yeah.
Okay.
And
their company bought one of my radio companies, Sporting News Radio, a couple years ago.
Now, WBBM was what network affiliate back in the 30s again? Or?
Oh, it still is CBS. It was always a CBS.
Right. WBBM was the one that ran The Shadow on Detective Story, and where The Shadow originated in 1932.
Before its home at Mutual.
Well, yeah, that was when The Shadow was still the narrator.
Yes, its original narrator. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, Detective Story Hour.
And, of course, later, at Mutual, Shadow was originally 5:30 and then moved up to 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoons, which made Brett Morrison the 5 o'clock Shadow.
Fantastic. That's excellent. Sir, there couldn't be a better caretaker for the characters and the reprints of the original stuff, and you continue to give us more information in the text pieces that you include in your publications. I'm really glad that you're the guy that's presenting the Shadow and Doc Savage and the other pulp heroes that you represent, and it's good to hear that these comic versions of the characters are also in your publishing future as well, and especially hearing that the Shadow scrapbook is coming back and is going to be bigger and better. I think that's great.
I will also mention just now that the new Shadow scrapbook will, among other things, have a 1934 Shadow edition radio script written by Gibson with the Pulp character, the black slouch hat and cloaks and 45 automatics, and with Harry Vinson and Cliff Marsland, the agents. There will be a lot of things never seen in the Shadow scrapbook. When I did the Shadow scrapbook, I hadn't interviewed Bill Johnstone. I didn't have photos of Ed Cartier or John Archer or Jimmy Licurdo, the first Shadow, or Frank Reddick in costume, or I didn't have photos at that time of Ed Cartier or a lot of the comic book artists. So there will be a whole lot that's never been seen. And one of the things that will be seen is I reproduce some photos in my books, is when Walter Gibson described Lamont Cranston's mansion, he described the mansion he'd grown up in.
Okay.
As I said, it was his 3-story, with 3-story marble pillars in front mansion that his parents had.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're a writer, you write about what you know, rather than make up the floor plan of a mansion. Well, I do that when you're familiar with every nook and cranny of the mansion you grew up in, which perfectly suited Lamont Cranston. Anyway, this has gone on for quite a bit of time, and I'm sure you're going to have to edit this down a lot.
Well, what I'm going to plan on doing is making it a multi-parter. I'll do a couple parts with you, and that would be great. I appreciate your time, and your we could do a wrap up if you want, but I do hope you'll come back and and talk some more, and we can get into some of the things that we've only just touched on. I mean,
anytime.
That would be great. And no, really, Anthony, I appreciate it very much. Thank you for your time, and I know the fans thank you for these excellent stories, and I look forward to our next conversation.
That was Anthony Tollin. It was a pleasure speaking to him. There's been a lot of things going on, obviously, that mean more conversation is necessary as far as comics history. So we've been doing a lot of that this year on Word Balloon to honor things like the 75th anniversary of Superman, the 50th anniversary of Spider-Man. It will continue in the weeks and months ahead with more guests. Keep listening to Word Balloon for the really interesting stories about comics and pulp history. Today's episode was brought to you by InStock Trades at InStockTrades.com. Great deals are going on at InStock Trades, and man, I'll tell you, some of this stuff, it just makes my wallet lighter and lighter. How about the Vampirella Archives hardcover Volume 7? That's 30% off. It's just $34.99. From Charlton, way back when, the Phantom Compendium series of comic books from Charlton, 25% off. It's $37.49. From Archie Comics, the 1,000-page comic digest trade paperback, 50% off. It's just $7.49. You can get our friend Catherine Immerman's Journey into Mystery, featuring Sif, trade paperback Volume 1, 50% off, just $7.99. FF by John Hickman, the trade paperback Volume 4 is 50% off, just $9.99. And Demon Knights Volume 2 from Paul Cornell, $7.49 at InStockTrades.com. Don't forget, if your orders are $50 or more, you receive free shipping. They pack everything nice. It's going to look great on your bookshelf, and it's going to be at a price you can't beat. Check it out for yourself. Go to their website, InStockTrades.com. John Suntress saying thanks again for listening to Word Balloon. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners, for your continued support. We couldn't do it without you. And I hope everyone has a safe and reflective Memorial Day. I'm sure everyone's going to have fun, but don't forget Memorial Day's real meaning. And think about some of the people that are no longer with us in body, but are, as always, in spirit. And have a nice thought for them on this Memorial Day, because really that's what the holiday is supposed to be all about. Questions or comments about the show, reach me via email, john@wordballoon.com. You can follow me on Facebook under my name, John Suntress, or at Twitter under @JohnWordBalloon. Until next time, thanks as always for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2013.